Good morning and welcome back to the Explicit Measures Podcast with Tommy and cold-filled Mike. I still have a cold. My nose is still congested. I'm sorry. It's going to sound a bit funny on the podcast. I'll do the best I can. I'm sorry.
Well, it's good to see your face.
I'm here. I made it. Just going to sound funny.
Oh.
Anywho, jumping in today for our topic today. We have a mailbag. This is a recorded episode for those of you who are listening online. Sorry, this is not a live episode. We're going through managing multiple data sets in Power BI. This is a mailbag topic that came in. We'll kind of unpack this concept. They've got some really very well written questions, so thank you, question writer. I don't know if I have a name on this one, but very well written. Really like this one. This will be good to unpack what's going on here and thinking through the different aspects of how do you manage multiple data sets and potentially even multiple data sources for those data sets all in one environment. All right, Tommy, you want to read us the question and we'll go from there?
Yeah, I am excited for this. And Mike, we made it overseas. So that's also super exciting. And it's not just Lake Michigan. Hello, guys. First of all, good job on the podcast. Keep it up. This is Mehmet from Turkey. So shout out to Turkey here. My gosh, that's amazing.
Yeah.
I'm not sure which category this fits in, so I'll just go ahead and shoot it. In our organization, we have many reports in Power BI, one for product, one for sales and opportunity, one for price data collected, stock levels, discounts, etc. I guess it's like this in pretty much all organizations. First question. All of these reports have their own data sets. Date, product, consumer are all common fields in all of them. Of course, discount reports have some different measures and stock level reports have its own and so on. Is it the best practice to have all these reports have their own data sets? If not, what is? By the way, data sources for all these reports are different. Some are Excel files, some are SAP, some are survey, etc. Second question, I need a report with certain items, surveys, and sales info. Currently, I connect to each data set with direct query and use the measures, or I need to create new ones if I need them. Thank you for your time.
Awesome. Two great questions. And I think this is actually very common. And I think as organizations grow in size, this typically becomes a talking point. Figure out how this works inside your organization. What's your initial reaction, Tommy?
You know, you think there's a one size fits all here, but there's a lot of variables at play. Obviously, you go right off the bat, ideally, we have one data set, multiple reports, but you're dealing with a few, I'll say, barriers for that to be easy to do. One of them being it's multiple sources here. So this is one that you really do have to unpack to honestly see what the best solution is here.
Yeah, I think I have found there comes a point when a model gets too large too. So I think there's a balancing act here a little bit between, is the model large enough, but is the model too large? You're trying to play a happy medium between these two, because I've also seen organizations have made this monolithic model where every single page of the report comes from one big semantic model. And while that makes sense in some cases, it gets very difficult to manage that model unless you're very organized with what is in the model, how you make it, what are all the different dimensions, and are there factual tables that do well inside that model. I think less about this is like the size of the model. I think I would even more pick on what is the structure of your model, right? Is there a lot of opportunity in the model for snowflaking? Do you have lots of tables referring to tables in like a sequence, like, dim user hangs on dim region, which hangs on the fact table. Like if there's a lot of snowflaking or chains of tables, I'm a little less inclined to say it's easy to use that model. There's another problem where you have like the detail and the invoice header and the invoice details, right? There's the invoice header that has all the summarized information of the invoice, and then you have all the detail, like the line items of the invoice. But those two typically are not in the same table sometimes. They're sometimes stored separately just because of the way the data stores. So there's a lot of, what I would say after doing this for so long, I feel like there's a lot of common patterns I've observed and see over and over again. And I guess my rule of thumb is I'd like to have one or two, maybe 3 or 4 reports hanging off of the same data set, if you can think about combining them that large. But if you get like 50 reports hanging off a data set, that means the data set is doing a lot of different things, and that might be too unwieldy to manage. especially when you have people building and developing them. You want to think about the developer pattern, right? Can like if you have 6 developers and you have one model, how do you merge all your changes together? How can anyone do changes on the same model? It also makes it a bit challenging. Sorry, I've seen a lot of.
No, you're golden. You're golden.
I'm thinking about this here.
Let's have fun, a little exercise here, because obviously there's the technical best practices, but what I would like to do, Mike, is how do you attack these situations, especially when there's a lot of unknowns, right? You may not know how many reports are hanging on. You may not know how the report may be. You may be building this for the first time. So when you have a lot of unknowns, I would love to know your kind of methodology on attacking this type of situation. So I'll jump in right away. Just honestly, if I were to deal with this situation when I don't have all of the factors at play, I don't have all the answers on the cheat sheet.
Sure.
There's really 2 ways that I start, and it's really downstream, upstream. I will write it out, and I am considering a few major items before I start even building. To your point, everything you just said about how many sources are we dealing with and what is the complexity to get the model in the shape we need it?
Yes.
How many steps does that take? Can I do that all in the semantic model? Is it coming from multiple, at this point, lake houses, but let's just say multiple data flows to get there. But I'm also dealing with the downstream, and it's not, Mike, just the number of reports, but odds are when you're in this complex of an organization or this large, you probably have to manage self-service. So that's another critical factor for me, are how many other people are touching that. So before I know anything, before I have all my answers, those are my 2 main priorities: the complexity to get to the right shape, and what are we going to be doing with this afterwards?
Oh, I think those are really good talking points to this. So the complexity, I think, is one. You asked, what are some things that I do when I walk into this kind of situation, right? A lot of times I like to sit back and say, what does your business do? And take a really high level picture as mapping out all the visual things that you do in your company, right? For example, I'm looking at their list of reports here, right? We have one for product age, we have one for sales, one for opportunities. Let's see here. He's also talking about some come from Excel, some come from SAP. So I'm looking at this and going, in my experience, when you build a fact table inside a semantic model, typically that fact table and its associated dimensions are used on a single page. There's occasions where you want to have 2 fact tables supporting a single page of reporting, but I don't really find that there's like 10 fact tables reporting a single page in a report. So let's take, I think about breaking down like the reports into like pages almost and start saying, okay, well, let me step back again. I'm going down to the weeds too quick. I'm looking at my organization. I'm thinking about the high level items, right? We have sales team. We have opportunities. What do we sell? Like making the big diagram and just kind of making some general associations. Like the sales team sells these products. The manufacturing team makes these products. What kind of products do we sell? Who's the customer? Just kind of mapping out like the very big blocks of like things that are important to us, right? Bill of materials, vendors, suppliers. Like, are we reporting on all those things, or are we reporting on something, a subset of that? So having just a general organization diagram, we sell to government, we sell to businesses, we sell direct to consumer. Some of those things change how the data comes into your system. Is that a different arm? Is the data coming in differently because it's from a different area of the business? You're selling to a different customer. Like that helps me understand like where the things should be related, because odds are your manufacturing data isn't sitting in SAP. Some of your customer data is sitting in some other system, a customer relationship program. And then the budgeting and the sales stuff typically sits in Excel, it seems like for me. Those are things that are sitting somewhere else. So if you look at the different pieces of like who's using what data, you can kind of map out a rough, kind of like a data map of like where the organization has information and what is useful to you in reporting. From that, we can then kind of talk about what I was alluding to earlier, which is like look at the pages, figure out what fact tables are used to support those pages. And are you doing summary pages, right? Is it a summary of all things around sales and opportunities?
Right.
because that's focusing on that topic. When you start spanning these two different topics, the reason that you have multiple models built out is because people are asking questions around that particular thing. Where things get impactful, I think, in reporting is when you say, oh, I could go to this sales opportunity and I can correlate some of that data to a different semantic model on a different area of our business. This sale turned into these products, which turned into those whatever other data points you have around that customer. Now you're having to bring other data systems or sets together to build something net new that you didn't necessarily have before. And that's really hard because you have to have those identifiers of the product in multiple systems. And how are you managing that?
I want to hyper focus on how you started your kind of conversation here, and I think this cannot be left unsaid. And honestly, I think what people struggle the most. You started that whole kind of workflow with a fundamental thing that was a question or multiple questions. I
Yes.
think a lot of people in our space struggle with not the build and technical side, but they
Yes.
struggle with asking the right questions right off the
Yes.
bat.
Yes.
And I for anyone listening to me, this is why I love what we do because yeah, all the tech in the world, you work with Microsoft's great, but
Sure.
if you cannot ask the right questions
Yes.
and kind of understand the situation before you need to get the right answers, so you got to ask the right questions. To
Yes.
your point, that's going to dictate it's going to dictate the work tree and the decision tree from here, just the
Yes.
fundamentals. How large are we building? Who's
Yes.
this for? How far downstream is this going to go? And
Yes.
even before you get to the data sources, my friend, this is such a fundamental skill that I think a lot of us need to work on and attune and always build on because it changes with every project.
Yeah, and I agree. And you're always getting better at this, I think, of asking the right questions. But I think taking sometimes this high level picture, because sometimes people get so focused
Yeah.
on, I need this table, I need this visual this way, I need these data sources brought together, that you lose the bigger picture of like what's really actionable, what's really important to the business longer term. And I think sometimes if we could step back a little bit, I also liked your question, Tommy, right? We're talking about reports that are being served to the organization. And this question, especially question part one, which is do we have multiple data sets or not? There's two things that stick out in my mind. How big are these individual data sets? Right? Are they all within 1 gig of size, smaller than 1 gig? Because then you can set everyone at a pro level and you save money. But as soon as you start making these larger semantic models, yes, they're great when they become larger. But do you add undue extra compute because the model is now larger, meaning the model is now 3 gigs in size. Well, if the model is 3 gig size in size now we have a different problem. A 3 gig size model now means we can't put it in a pro user anymore. We have to go to something else. Premium per user is usually the next option, or we start going up to a premium P SKU to look at that. Great, gives us more opportunity, but now we're spending substantially more money than what we were before, potentially at a pro user level. So if you're a big organization, likely is you have P or F SKUs already. If you're in a smaller organization and you're growing, you probably don't have the budget to like go out and spend $5,000 a month. That's 60 grand a year just in reporting. So most smaller organizations don't have the stomach to really, they don't have that many people needing data.
Yeah.
And I guess maybe my really weird opinion on this is I think about what's the price per user, right? If you have a 10,000 user organization and you're turning on a P1 every month, that's like 50 cents per user to use the P1 to do things, right? That, and it's aside from like the $10 per month for the creators of content, but like consumers of content, right? That makes a lot more sense when you have that scale versus when you have a 10 or 100 user organization, $5,000 to do reporting for that organization now becomes much more prohibitive because, well, now you're at a, you know, $50 per user. Well, then that doesn't make sense. So it really, I think it depends on the scale of your business, and those larger businesses are able to swallow those costs more because you're actually bringing the price per user way down at that higher level.
Yeah. And I think that's a good point because a lot of those are going to be questions that or that those answer a lot of additional questions later down the road because obviously you need to know your constraints.
Yes, agree. So I think that's really important there. Just how you distribute the reports, where they're coming from. I really don't love. I mean, anytime someone says, "Oh, one of my tables is sourced from Excel," I just can't stand that. It's
I
so
know.
prone to error. It's going to happen. I can't avoid it. It's not something I can. It's not something I'm going to avoid. I'm just going to be like, every time I hear that, I put up red flags. I put
Okay.
up bells and whistles, and I just have reflections of um, just feelings of like, oh, this is going to be a pain. This is going
There's a
to.
lot of stories from the trenches you got.
There's a lot of stories from the trenches, and they've been some of them have been quite painful to get through to get to the right answers, to get a
Okay.
solution that's like reliably refreshing. Well, and it wasn't the problem with the data initially; it was the data drift of that Excel file over time. That was the problem. That's
All
usually the
right.
problem.
I'm going to give you a scenario with that. A little off topic here, but honestly, though, the Excel thing I think we know is part of our world. If I had to give you one of two bowls, one is data with Excel, and that's just part of the company, or the other is we want paginated reports, but we just need data dumps, and that's what you're dealing with. Which bowl are you choosing, man? I'm choosing the Excel one all day. It's frustrating, but I can handle that.
What was the second bowl? I was blowing my nose during that one.
Paginated reports or just data dumps. We think we need paginated reports, but we just want data dumps. Which one do we want to work on? Which one is going to be more successful down the road?
Are you talking about? Are you asking about outputs of information, or are you
I'm
talking
saying
about
your preference to work with.
inputs of information? Right.
Yeah.
Ooh. Well, I think what I prefer is machine generated data. That's
Okay.
what I prefer, which I think errs on the side of not Excel. It errs on the side of like paginated reports or data extracts that come from a system. Those are my preferences because it's very consistent. The only thing that really changes is like when someone goes back into the source system and adds a new column or renames
Yeah.
something. Like sometimes those source systems or the computer generated code or data sometimes comes out in a weird way. I can easily absorb flat files into any system. Doesn't matter. Power Query, I'm using notebooks,
Right.
JSON, like it doesn't really matter. Like that structured data, very easy to get into other systems. So I'm not actually too worried about it. So my preference would probably be that structured stuff. Now, I love Excel for the flexibility of it. And I think that's why, I mean, it's a huge tool. Over 800 million people use Excel every day or
This is
monthly active users. Like, so there's like so much of it out there. Like, you're going to run into it. It's going to be a thing. What I wish would happen, and this is just my wishing here, right? I wish we had a better way to control like a table definition inside Excel.
mhm.
So Excel does a great job with table definition, does a great job with making formulas, all the things. I really wish there was a way to like have some advanced controls and passwords potentially not essentially on
I
the
know what you mean.
Excel sheets, but like on the table of Excel.
I know
Like,
what you mean.
you know what I mean? Like, so these columns are defined as these names. Like, this is the name of these columns: ID, name, first name, email. Like, that's, and I lock it in, and you can't add new columns. Or if you did, the data I'm loading out of the table doesn't get
Yeah.
affected by those new columns. And again, I'm less inclined about new columns. It's not my problem. It's when you change the existing columns. I'd also like Excel in the table definitions to give me like a data quality metric. Like, hey, this column requires a number. And if
Mhm.
anyone enters a non-number into this column of this table, it throws an error and says, this is not a number, fix it. Or, I mean, the point is you can do these things with Excel, but it's much more difficult to lock down that cell with data validation in a way that like forces people to make it correct.
So you call it challenge. I call it opportunity. First, I want to say one
Sure.
thing though. When anytime you tell me the frustrations you have with Excel, in my head, I hear, yeah, I would like to eat ice cream and not gain weight. Listen, I know there's fundamentals in life. If I have Ben and Jerry's, I got to get another pair of
If I'm
pants.
eating Chubby
And
Hubby, you will have a Chubby Hubby.
yeah, exactly. And
Yes.
that's just the world, that's the world we live in, with Excel being a critical part of a lot of organizations when it comes to their data. So, but to your point, with if Excel is going to be part of our lives, whether we like it or not, honestly, you know what? Where I call it opportunity is if I'm ever part of these projects, this is a great opportunity to me always for Power Apps, because I cannot tell you the amount of projects I've worked on where it started with Excel as a critical data source. And we started going through the same kind of questionnaire, like, what are we using Excel for? Who touches it? Like, how many hands does it go through? Is it
Agree.
just an export? And what we found out was this is just an application waiting to happen.
Yep.
This is an application in a cocoon waiting to
Agree.
flutter its wings.
Yes.
And so if you do have Excel, that's a critical source, because one thing we both agree on, an Excel data source touching any semantic model can never become certified. That is a
I think that's a
fundamental
very
rule.
hard. Yeah. You have to move that into something else more
Right.
reliable.
So if you want it to be great, but let's put it to your point, what you're looking for is something with allowed values, a drop down. So I can only choose one of these four options.
Sure.
I have to fill in these things. Those are the common issues with Excel. That's why we don't like Excel. It's because cannot control the inputs.
And to be clear, all these things can be
Yeah.
controlled. They can be
Yeah.
Excel. This is my point. Like, it can be developed and built that
Right.
way. It's just not the best place to build and develop that
Right.
things. And now you're relying on this Excel sheet. And I mean, I have built some of the most egregious Excel files. This is
Yeah.
part of the reason why I can speak to this, because I've done this. I've made the not mistake, but I've done the work to make a really complicated Excel file, like to the tune of I had a list of users who could access the file and who could edit it and who could not. I had security on it. If you tried to
All
edit
of those.
something you
Yeah.
couldn't touch, it would pop up a menu and say, "Hey, you're not allowed to access or edit this thing. Don't do this." I had a data validator, and it would rip through all the data, and it had standard tables of every single column that I needed to data validate against, and it would go through and it would highlight. It would go through and literally change colors of cells of things that were incorrect. This is, I mean, we built a data application inside Excel, and it worked. It did
Yeah.
its job, but at the other hand, it was like, what should we have been building? To your point, Tommy, it should have been a Power App. It should have been something else. The only downside of Power Apps I do not like around using it as a data source. Power Apps are really good for manipulating data on a row by row basis.
Yeah.
The one thing I find that's weak about a
Bulk.
Power App is if I want to have a formula across multiple rows that I'm editing or modifying or doing something, or I want to copy paste like 30 rows in at a time because it's coming from somewhere else. That's just one area that I don't think does very. I mean, I could be wrong.
It gets more complex at that
Power
point.
Apps just doesn't do a great
So,
job with table level experience things. It manages really well a row of data, and this is the record I'm going to pull out, or even
yeah.
like multiple, like, so
No.
this one row points to these other data tables. Like, it can pull like multiple tables together into one common structure. No problem. Like, I'm totally happy with it. It does a great job. But that's where I think why people don't use Power Apps or go learn it, because they have to now fall back to like, yeah, but I just really want my big table where I can just edit a lot of things at once. And that's what Power Apps doesn't do a great job of.
It gets more complex. Honestly, man, I am more and more feeling that every Excel file is a Power App's waiting to spread its wings. That's really where, and it can do it, but yeah, to your point,
It's a very pointed statement. I wouldn't say everyone. A lot of them are. I could probably agree with that. But everyone, I think it's a bit aggressive on the every Excel file could become a Power App, because I think Power Apps has its own weaknesses in its own way.
It's got a ring to it. But you're right. You're right. There's obviously a lot of other factors at play, but I think what we're trying to say here, the bigger picture here is when you do with Excel, you have to understand too, there are going to be complications there. And I think if someone's tasking me, like, let's put this all together, and we have identified that Excel is a critical source, I am being very vocal in an email, so it's documented. Like, we can do this, we can build this.
You being very vocal
But
to me, never.
yeah. You know what happens is actually a thing people say about me. So surprisingly enough. So, no, but I think you have to be though. You have to be vocal. Like, we can build this. We can build a semantic model that's gonna have multiple reports. But let's also identify the issue that there's going to be issues that arise because we're dealing with Excel here.
100%. And there's a clear, I'm writing out risks and rewards of this a little bit to some degree as well. So I'm always very clear with like, hey, we can, 100% Power BI can do it. 100% not an issue for me. I'm all on board for doing whatever we need to do, pulling this data out of Excel. Here's what I'm going to say. It's going to be like, here's some requirements, this, and this. And again, I have seen Excel files that are complete databases. I have seen Excel files
Right.
that have the right controls, that have been the right amount of lockdown. You can't add columns. You can't do things where you shouldn't be doing them. Like I've seen really well-designed Excel files that have data validation in them.
Yeah.
So all this is not to rag on Excel and say Excel can't do what I'm describing. It most certainly can. But I think if you tell me we have to use Excel, I'm going to pull all of my Excel tools out of my toolbox, and I'm going to work very hard on that Excel file to make sure that it's giving me as clean of data as it possibly can every single time. And there's almost minimal to no risk of anyone modifying it so it breaks things, especially if it's on critical reporting. Like, I get it. And I might even do some data validation checks when I load it into Power Query for the first time. I may check data types of columns and check to make sure this column has no nulls on it. Like I might build extra data quality checking on that Excel file so that way I know immediately to fail that file and not load it. Like there is like fail on error type things you can do where if it can't load a file, if it can't read the data correctly or can't find a column, you can just not have it load at all so it doesn't break your downstream processes.
You touched a nerve here, not in a very positive way here. I think something that is worthy of a discussion. So we know that there's certain sources that are, have their problems, but the critical reporting to me is a major factor here, because if I'm dealing with a marketing department or sales department, we just need to build something. This might come up. I'll let them know, but we can build, build, baby, and keep it going. But as soon as we start getting to larger reporting that's more critical for the organization, what's your take on this? And this is something I've done in the past, but I want to get your take. It's critical reporting for the organization. It's gonna be seen for higher level ups, and it is dealing with unworthy sources, be it Excel or other things that are just not something we'd have in mind. Before we start building those semantic models, I've gotten guarantees like we can build it now, but I need a guarantee, or I'm copying my boss that there is a plan to migrate those sources to something more structured before we start building, and letting everyone know. What's your take on getting that as a guarantee beforehand?
I
Because I
mean,
know we can't control everything.
in my world, I would say my word is my bond, right? If I said I'm going to migrate with that, like I would be the commitment there. But I think what you're maybe pointing on a little bit more is you are really trying to handle data ownership, data stewardship of that source, right? So I think I had to like really put my hand on this one. It's like what I'm really trying to negotiate is I'm trying to do a data contract. Like you say the only way I can get the data is through Excel. Fine. It will come to me like this every single time. And if it breaks, you're going to be the one to fix it. It's not going to be me, because I can't tell you the number of times where someone says, oh, the data comes from Excel.
Yeah.
I'm the one picking up their data and lifting it to our data platform, albeit like it's, hey, I'm going to a SharePoint page and I'm reading your data in from someplace. I'm making it either a lakehouse table or I'm directly bringing it in with Power Query right to the model. That's okay, right? All these things are acceptable. But if the data somehow fails, there's an obligation on me to say, Michael, do you know why the data set did not load? I have to be at a very quick glance, understand what failed in the process, immediately be able to identify, oh, it was or was not the Excel file. So that's kind of like the data, handoff, right? So the responsibility of them starting the table and me loading the table, those are two different teams' responsibility that data contract is being handled. And so when they break their data contract, not if, like when they break their data contract, I need to have something in place that says, hey, I will send you an email when something breaks. And then there needs to be, and I would also extend this a little bit, Tommy, too, right? For mission critical things, you're talking about like high level, C-level people in the organization. Most people start understanding, like when reporting gets to that level, if something fails, people stop their daily job and jump to go fix the problem. So I just want to make sure at the beginning of the project I have in writing, this data will be correct. There's a turnaround time that you're guaranteeing me. If there's a problem, there's a contact person and there's a backup person. Like these are the kind of things I'm thinking about.
You have to.
If Joe's on vacation and the CEO is trying to do something and their Excel file's junked and I can't fix it, and I'm technically not the owner of their data, I shouldn't be going in and writing new Power Query to fix the data loading. I should be going back to that. I should be going back to the Excel file and saying, fix your bad data. And this is this is not just Excel. Like this happens in all different systems, even structured systems, like even Salesforce. Salesforce, same problem. People put in random weirdo data there all the time. Like, why didn't you fill out the customer's email address? I'm getting all these blanks in the report because there's no email addresses in here. Like, it's on my miss as the data engineer to say the quality of my data coming into the system is not clean enough. So I need to kick this back to the source team and say, look, you guys need to stop sending us junk data. You own the Salesforce data. Go in and fill out this data on these records because it's missing. It's just being more thoughtful and like, again, it's
dude.
I think we're on the same page here, but I'm just really trying to say like there's lots of different teams working together to kind of build parts of this data pipeline. And if any parts of those pipeline fail, we need to be able to identify what failed, who's responsible for it, and that responsible entity or person needs to own it. And this is a lot of the the people and process side of Power BI that's not in the tool. Like it's you have to write this process down. You struck a nerve with me here on this one because this is a really, I think, important note that we are doing here, where it's a lot about. I'm going to use this term very generously in this conversation. Data stewardship. It's a lot of data stewardship. Who owns it? Where do we go when there's problems with it? And as you pass that data downstream, what are we doing to monitor it so that way when something goes bad, there's reporting that has immediate effects of we're missing, something's wrong, something in the process is not right. We did a refresh, but the record count did not change. Or a file we counted, we were trying to load 15 files, we only loaded 14. It's that kind of stuff you need to check for when you get to that certified, really important level of reporting to make sure you're not losing data. And that erodes the confidence in what you're building as a data product.
And I'm telling you to preach, man, because it cannot be understated here. It is unavoidable.
I feel like we need a gospel choir kind of jumping up in here and be like, data, clap a little bit.
Data culture for the win. Yeah,
because
well, but it's you know what? If you could find one, I know we got some sound effects now, but
we do. I got you.
Yes. Yeah. So that's our preach. That's our amen.
Preach it.
But it is unavoidable in the long term. If you're building any model that's going to be downstream or has multiple data sources here that go across departments, for this not to be an issue.
Yes.
We've talked about technical debt in the past, but honestly, if you're building a model like the mailbag question is asking, and you're not talking to anyone, that's data culture debt, because eventually you're going to have to pay the piper at some point if you're not having these conversations off the bat. And I think this is the curse and the blessing of Power BI, right? Because it's so easy to build. I can sit on my desk. I can use a single monitor. It is so easy I could build this all in a single day without talking to a soul. But that's not the point here. If I want this to be long-standing, I have to have these conversations. I have to have these agreements if I'm going to be successful, first off. And if the report's going to be successful. I think I want to state too, to your point, this is not just for the BI team to CYA to make sure that they're not in trouble.
Correct.
Right? And I think that's how it's healthy.
Yeah, you're right. I think what I'm describing here sounds a lot like CYA for the data team.
Not my fault kind of thing.
Not my fault. It's somebody else. But I think there's a bigger issue here. If your data culture is only focusing on CYA level activities, I think where you're going with this, Tommy, is like that's the wrong kind of approach we should be thinking about here. We really should be thinking about here is the data is transitioning ownership between multiple hands within the company. Are we having a healthy contract related to the data as we pass this data from one team to the next team to the next team? And that's really what we're doing. So, in all the way through the process, we're trying to instill confidence everywhere we go.
And I think that's the biggest point. Really, the fundamental thing that we're trying to do with those data contracts is, can we, the organization and the people, trust the data?
Yes, and because our process to know how to fix it. Yeah, it's going to go bad at some point.
The situation that happens is someone's going to ask me, why are there all blanks, or why did it error out? And if I can't answer that, that's a loss of trust. But if I can say, oh, well, operations, yada, yada, at least we know where to go and we know what occurred. So that's a huge point. And I'm glad that we harped on this, because
Yeah, it's
I
a
know
good
that's not what the
tangent.
question was, but you have to answer these questions.
You're right. I want to kind of just reiterate the question so we can answer question number one about what's going. Because I want to be. We've talked about some things. I don't think we've really like answered the question. So I'd like to just kind of like really hone into the question here, just for first question, because I do want to give this an ample answer. I guess is what I'm trying to say. So the question here is it best practice to have all the reports have their own data sets? If not, what is? And then, by the way, all those reports are all the source of data for those reports are different. Some are Excel files and some are SAP. So let me answer the question directly. Right? Is it best practice to have all the reports have their own data sets? If you have a one report, one data set for every single thing that you build, that is wrong. Like I would say that is not an efficient use of your time. Yes, you can do that in certain occasions. There will likely be certain data sets that will only have one report in them ever. That's okay. And you may be building the model with one report that's being published to the customer.
Sure.
But the customer may build a lot of other reports on top of the data set. So that's to your point, your earlier question, Tommy, was like, how are people expected to consume this? What are you doing with the data? Are you just dumping the data out, or are you actually looking at a report, seeing the numbers, and then walking away and saying, I'm going to go take action on this page of data? Like that's a different kind of pattern here, right? You know, when I'm managing my consulting business, I'm looking at all the employees and saying who's working on what, and if I need to pivot people from different projects or work, that I'm looking at that page. I don't need to download the Excel sheets to figure out who's doing what. Like I have the page of data. I'm looking purely at the data page, and that's where I make my decisions from. So I would say it's not best practice to have a one-to-one relationship for everything you design. I'm looking for a one to a few or one to a many kind of relationship for one data set, a couple reports that are answering the questions. And I even think of it sometimes in the same way as if you think about what the report is serving, you could answer, like when you think about the questions, let me unpack a little bit more of the question here, right? So the one of the data sources they talked about was like sales and opportunities, right? What kind of questions are you answering about sales and opportunity, right? Is there trending that you're looking at? If you're looking at comparisons over time, are you looking at, is there a, am I really focusing on this month's sales versus all sales? Is there compensation that's going from sales? So there's a lot of aspects that go around sales and opportunities for the sales team. And I really want to hone in to your point earlier, Tommy. Why do they need this report? What kind of questions are we answering? And then grouping those questions together to form, okay, if we're talking about sales compensation, that might be its own report that we give to everyone so that way they can see how many sales they've made and what's their compensation towards those sales so they know how much their bonus is going to look like, right? That incentivize, that's a driver. You're giving people those metrics to drive them to a certain action, right? You want money. I want to give you money. I want more sales in my business. Let's align our goals here so that way you see what your reward's going to look like so you work harder towards your goals.
Right.
That's great. Let's do that. So that's the kind of stuff that I'm talking about there. So that makes more sense to me to break those things out. And so in that vein, I take all these insights or questions, I group them together into common topics, and then I figure out, do all these, like if I have a 30 questions, does that become, those 30 questions become an entire report with multiple pages? Or does that 30 questions, is that too much information to be giving in one report? Because you build a report, and again, I'm talking about Power BI. You build a Power BI report for a specific purpose. There's usually a reason why you're trying to get to that report. There's a main goal, a main theme of that report. And so if you try to put too many main themes together, the story gets jumbled. You don't know where to look. And there may be new questions that are coming about the data, right? You're looking at sales and opportunity, and all of a sudden you have a manufacturing issue. Okay. Well, how does that impact all your sales and opportunity? Is that changing things? Or if you're deprecating a product, like there's, we're doing market research to figure out what new product should we be building? Those are all things that might be separate reports, and you may need to do explorations or figuring out what's in the data. That doesn't belong in your main report. So if your data report is trying to tell you something versus explore the data, those are two different worlds of how you think about using data. And so in the exploration world, you're using other things like analyze in Excel. You're
Right.
dropping the data down. Like, again, we harp on Excel, but we use it everywhere. You use an exploration in PowerBI.com. You use a metric set to go explore a particular KPI or measure to figure out what makes sense with that part of data. Those are the kind of things I'm going to be using more of the tools that are at my disposal in PowerBI.com. If we're really trying to measure goals and expectations, maybe I should be using scorecards that suck data out from an actual report every time it's refreshed. Like, there's a lot of other opportunities here in the service that would make this easier for us. And I'll pause. I said a lot there. I'm sorry, Tommy.
Yeah, and I think we eventually get to the same place, but I think we have actually very different approaches. So I used to write in college a ton of skits, and one of the questions we'd always ask anytime we had a joke was, does this have legs? How long can that joke or that skit go? Does that actually have something here?
That's a good question to ask with reporting. Does this report have legs?
And this is what I mean. So
Yep.
really a fundamental rule of thumb that I do, and again, without the one size fits all kind of thing, is even if I'm not doing managed self-service, if I were, who would be touching this? That is usually the logical approach I have to how much we're building or how complex the model is. Because there are some organizations you can build a single model and it could cover everybody's reporting. But that doesn't make any sense if other people want to build off of that because there's just too many tables. It's too complex for a power user or someone to actually build off of that. It could cover technically all of my data or a few models, but it doesn't make sense if I were to build. So the idea of does
Totally
this have
agree on that one.
legs is
Yes, 100%
if
agree.
if I were to build a report here, who logically would touch it from marketing? If it's like,
Yes.
okay, these people, so why would it have all this sales data? Why would it have all this operations data? Would they ever need this? Would that get too complex for them?
Yes.
And
And if there's
typically that's
and there may not even be a logical join between the two things. There might
right,
not be
exactly.
a good connection between the two because, like, hey,
Right.
we had to match on like email address. Well, that's not a good match. Like, we actually need a customer key, but where does that come from? Well, it's in a system we
Exactly.
don't have access to, and we can't get into
Right.
these. So, like this is where now you're jumping into the world of like this should be data engineered. We need to get the data down to a common place from all these different sources and start figuring out how to like massage and play with the data.
Right.
And this is where I'm going to maybe link a little bit more on the second question a little bit to your point. I think where you're going with this, Tommy, a little bit too, is right now he's talking about reports and models. Fabric opens up a lot more of this for data discovery, for data engineering, for like predictive things that we haven't even talked about yet.
Right.
So in order to prepare ourselves for this next level of analytics you're trying to get yourself to, you don't just build reports just to build reports, right? You want to be strategic about building reports. Build reports and put the data in a place where you can reuse the data and think about, okay, once we pile up the data into a central lakehouse thing, can we then start utilizing that lakehouse element to start doing other new analytics? Everyone's talking about AI on top of something somewhere. So are you putting your data in a place that it's ready and it's usable for AI? That's another question. So you want to build in a way that's going to be future proof to some degree. You can't 100% do it, but like this is an area we want to focus on. Build it in a way that I could use it in other ways in the future.
Right. But again, I think the critical thing that usually when I'm going into situations like this, what I find when taking a client is I'm always backtracking, right? I'm never expanding on a model that they have. Like, can you grow this? Right. A lot of times I go in, it's like, it's always usually too complex and we have to downsize a lot of the models. That's usually where complexity happens because you could think about AI, you could think about scorecards or how wide it can go. And it can. A model can have a lot of legs, but to your point, like we also don't want it too complex for the organization where I'm the only one who understands it and I can apply it everywhere. And I think this is a big part here too. Like we needed to be human readable or understandable for people where I may not be the only one looking at it.
I think that's a design criteria that you're looking at. I think that's I think very early in this situation, right? If you have a data set and it's to this example, first question, right? I have a one data set, one report for multiple things. I'm not afraid to have 30 models. 30 models is fine.
Yeah.
As long as you can manage them and you know the scope of what's inside them, right? Good with it. Not a problem. as soon as you start making larger monolithic models of everything, you have to know that it's like a balancing act, right? You increase the size of the model, which increases the weight, and it starts reducing the number of people that are going to be able to use and look at it and understand it. So if you're building just reports and you're not going to expect people to build on top of the semantic model, fine, build a big model, put all the tables together, not a problem. However, if you're going to build where you want people to start self-servicing and doing a managed self-service managed environment where some of the data comes from IT and some of the reports come from the business, now you're looking at a model that should be probably simpler. And not to say that if your data culture supports complicated models, great, good on you. You've done the training. You've taught people how to use Power BI, and there's no issue if you figured out how to use measures and make things work. Wonderful. That I find is very rare, that the entirety of the company understands what a semantic model is, how relationships work, and DAX measures. Like, so there's just things in there that are like, you probably should start with a simpler model. And as people get comfortable with it, and as they learn it, then you can start growing these models to more complicated solutions.
So, Mehmet, I think that second question may be another topic, but there's a critical elephant in the room here. And I need to ask you this because it has been bugging me this whole conversation. There are really two different areas here that I think are left unexplored. There is model creation, where we are building from the ground up this new approach and design.
Yep.
And then there's model migration, where we already have these existing models already in the ecosystem.
Yes.
And this is bugging me, man, because we have to talk about this, because odds are a lot of people are like, it's not like they're going from nothing to something. There's already something that's already in place and dependency, something, so what's your approach? And how do you approach migration? Because I think we've talked more about creation than actually migrating models into one and blending together.
Yeah, and this is a really good question, because the second question here is like, hey, I need a report with stock levels and some sales information. So now we're going to say I need some information from one model, but other information from a different model. So this is where I'm going to start really pointing on, like, this is where Fabric, I think, really excels. Fabric excels. That's funny. Good pun.
I just got it.
I think this is where Fabric really shines, is because when I'm starting to join different tables from different sources, I need a place to put those tables to potentially continue shaping them for the final report. Now, what you're doing here currently is if you're using direct query to analysis services. So the feature, what you're doing is you're building a composite model where you have two existing models and you're building a third that relies upon the prior two models. Now, I have found really good performance in those models if you're just using the measures and the dimensions just side by side. If you're not trying to join dimensions between, so Microsoft has a term for this. The model is an island. So every model you build is an island. And so when you're building a composite model, you're combining multiple islands. Okay? So we have the island of sales. We have the island of stock levels. These are two different semantic models that are separate. They're called them islands because they're all of them owned. They're there. If you pull a measure from each of those islands and put it on the same report page, no issue, not a problem. But as soon as you try to have a common dimension that spans both islands, that's when we start getting complication. And Microsoft has admittedly said you have to test the performance of composite models when you're jumping dimensions between models, because what has to happen is island number one has to pull together a list of unique values and send it to model island number two. You say, hey, I'm interested in these categories, these regions, these product numbers. That list can get really long and very large because it has to send it in text between one model to the other model. There's no intra-model communication that's happening here other than like, this is the filtered list of parameters. So if you keep to answer your question too, keep your islands separate and use only the measures together on the report, probably fine. Probably not a big deal.
Yeah.
As soon as you start having common dimensions, now I'm going to be saying I probably should be looking at bringing the loading of those tables into a common place. Again, I would argue bring those tables to the lakehouse, Once the tables are in the lakehouse, you can build a common dimension for dates or products or whatever. And now you build a brand new semantic model that has the two fact tables from the prior data sets, but now has a new combined unique dimension area that actually spans both tables. And you physically need new relationships between
Right.
spanning those models. That's what you
Well,
really want.
you're building in a sense a mental Venn diagram in your head, and I have two of them usually. It's the technical
Yes.
overlap and the people overlap. And I'm not saying it's like 81%, but it's something like that for both of those. How many people are the same people are looking at this, and how much of the data is the same?
Yeah.
And honestly, once there's a certain threshold, you go, okay, now it makes more logical sense in the long term for this to be in a single model compared to them being separate. But it has to have, and again, I wish I had a number like 84% overlap, where that's when we start building. But there's a number there. There's something there that kind of tells you. Is that experience, or would you say where would it be that kind of cutoff?
I mean, again, I think this is all going to boil down to like, what are you comfortable in, right? Again, I'm assuming based on what the
That's a good
questions around
point.
here, you're probably comfortable in building Power BI reports. You're probably comfortable in making semantic models. Like, if that's been your world,
Really good point.
if you're just doing that, then if what I'm saying now is, yeah, just go to Fabric and just load everything there. You're like, well, how do I have to go to Dataflows Gen 2? How does that get run? What's a pipeline? So when I say just do it in Fabric, there's a lot of other technical pieces that need to come together to make the Fabric thing work well for what you're trying to build, and that's okay. What I will say though is the need still exists. How you solve that need will probably vary depending on what you build inside
Yeah.
Power BI and or Fabric. So I'm going to look at this feature here. So there is this feature that, and I haven't played with it enough. And this is, to me, looking at this going, let's imagine I have two semantic models that are loading data every whatever the cadence is. Why don't I just turn on the feature to store that semantic model data in the lakehouse and get tables there, and then I can just build a new semantic model on top of it with new relationships. The challenge of this, the principle of the challenge here is I already have fact tables being loaded somewhere. I don't want to reload them again. I don't want to hit the data source system again. I'm trying to be efficient, right? I don't want to duplicate my data multiple times. That's what I'm trying to avoid with this.
Why would you do shortcuts? Like, to me, the design, the challenge, the approach completely changes with Fabric, because
Yes.
shortcuts are my jam at this point, because I can't have everything structured, all these fact tables, and just a shortcut to my date table, a shortcut to my product table, and a lot of these where that also eliminates too the problem of redoing a query and making sure everything's aligned. And it really does challenge how we build that semantic model too. It's a big point. This is a really good point.
So to me, like I'm looking at like in the tools that I have in Power BI, I'm kind of limited, right? I'm using composite models. I'm doing
Right. We're dealing with what we've been dealing with.
Yes, I'm looking at what I'm in the Power BI realm to solve question number 2 is kind of one or two options. As soon as I introduce Fabric, the amount of features that get available to me and allow me to expand my thinking of what this looks like, as soon as I say Fabric is an option, and again, that's a big if right here, because not every organization is there yet. Not every organization wants to use it, which is okay. I'm totally cool with that. But as soon as I see Fabric is an option, to me, I need to rethink a lot of what I'm doing. Does all of my data get loaded to the lakehouse? Should I be pulling data into that place first and then building my semantic models? Because now, in the same way I was building a semantic model with multiple reports, I can now build tables that make multiple semantic models that build multiple reports. So the whole data strategy, I think, changes with Fabric. And to me, it's a much better story. And it's a much more effective usage of your time to build common tables, data stuff, and things as well. So I really like that story. So, I guess the short answer to your question here is if your direct query is still giving you the performance you want and the report is not super laggy slow, keep doing it. It should work just fine, right? Monitor your usage. If you're using premium per user, you probably have plenty of compute laying around that it's not going to be a big issue. Just make sure it's fast. My only caveat with question 2 would be if your reports or clicking on things gets too slow, like 1 or 2 seconds every time you click on something, users will start getting unhappy and they'll be like, this is not helpful
Yeah.
to me. I don't like waiting. So then you need it when it gets slow, then we need to rethink our steps and maybe rebuild something a little bit differently.
Yeah. I mean, and just I'll touch on that real quick as well. Usually, anytime I've been brought to a project like this, it's always measures that are going to have the problem first. Obviously, there's
Yes.
performance issues, but we're probably dealing with something people are trying to do with DAX that they can't do in the model the way it's structured. But
That's
honestly,
usually when I see really
that's
complex
the first
DAX,
issue. Yeah,
I'm like, your model is not structured
dude.
right. That the
Yeah,
model needs to be fixed, which means you need to do more
I,
table manipulation upstream.
I,
And if you're only in Power
I
Query, like,
know.
do you
Yeah,
have enough compute? Is your compute strong enough to change the data?
I know you love having 15 filters nested within each other, but there's a better way.
There's a better
Um,
way.
so I can always rank how good one of our episodes is how many new topics come from that. Just so you know, we got I have 3 awesome ideas from here because this is something honestly, and this will kind of be my closing thought. We're awesome. We're at time and great, again, great mailbag. This is something that a lot of people is always going to be the constant battle, right? Because I think we touched on really 3 aspects here that are part of our job, and it is the technical skill. It's a huge part in how we design, not just being able to build it, but can we build it for a long time? It's asking the right questions and approaching these situations off the bat with the right people in the right way.
That's the
And it's having
and that's the people part of this thing. So the
and
technical
that's the
part was
people.
technical, can we do it? And the
Right.
people part is like, are we asking the
Right.
right questions? We understand
Are
why
we asking the
we're doing
right
it.
question? And
Yeah,
the
and then you're
process to me is the data contracts. And
yes,
it's making sure we have that
yes.
agreement. And that's if you want it to be long standing, you want to have, if you, in a sense, you want something to have a long life cycle, you have to have all 3 components squared away.
Yeah, I agree. I like this topic. So my final thought here would be is, it's a balancing act. It's going to be a balance between the value, the number of people building your semantic models to start centralizing them and bringing them
Mhm.
together. I think if you're in a pure Power BI world, keep doing what you're doing. You're doing the right thing. You want to maximize your effort for reuse. If you're spending too much time working in too many small models,
Mhm.
it might be time to join some of them together. A lot of times I'll go into a project and I will just write down every table name and draw out, or just even take a screenshot of all the diagrams in each of the models. So I've done this before. I go to Miro. If I have 3 or 4
Right.
models, I'll put all the tables in the model, make it nice and clean so I can see everything in one page. Take a screenshot, put it in Miro, and I will draw colored squares around everything that is common. And then I'll stand back and look at it and say, okay, which models are most similar? Which ones have the most common stuff? Those are the models I potentially would join. You don't need to join everything. I wouldn't make a monolithic model for everything. I've also seen the problem on the other end where everyone throws every table into one single model. Also not helpful. Wouldn't do it. Don't recommend it. So it's a balance between making the models large enough that it's easy to manipulate, but not so large that no one understands what you're trying to build in it. And that's the balancing act.
Yeah.
So that would be one area I would put there. And then my other final thought here around, multiple models together. I'm going to say it 1,000 times, and I love how it works right now. Fabric is incredible. The amount of feature, like the ease of feature, the ease of moving from the lake house into the
Can't avoid it.
models, it's so good. Direct Lake models, the data engineering tools that I get, the Python notebooks, the Python notebook and PySpark. Man, I have so many more tools. Like, I feel so confident coming to any project. Like, if you give me Fabric, I can solve any problem. There hasn't been a single thing I've walked into like I can't figure it out. And so that's really rich. I like that experience. I like having a tool. I like walking in with a Swiss Army knife that can do almost anything I need
Right.
it to do. So yes, you have to know the tech really well. Yes, you have the performance tune to know what's going on, but you're not going to stump me. I'm going to have unlimited scale at my fingertips. And you want to do a billion row table? No problem. Fabric can handle it. You want to do real time data? Fabric can handle it. Like, it's got tools for these things that make it easy for me to work with this data and make it work well for whatever you're building. And I feel like at a reasonable cost. It's not, yes, you pay for what you use, but it's not like this egregious expense. You can build things in a very lean way if you need to. So
1,000%.
Anyways, that being said, thank you very much for watching the podcast or listening to it. We hope you had a good exercise, run, jog, whatever thing you're doing, or biking. I guess I gotta throw biking. Tommy's a big biker, so I gotta throw biking in there as well. Hope you had a good exercise with us on the podcast. We hope you're talking along with us. We hope we're saying things, and I've had people tell me they go for their walk and they're laughing and they're talking and they're like, "Oh, that's a stupid idea. We should never do that." Oh, yeah, this makes a lot of sense. So we hope you're engaging with the conversation either in the chat or just on your own. Don't like a weirdo. Definitely don't do that. But that being said, if you like this podcast, if you like the content that we're generating here, we really appreciate your ears and your time. We know your time is valuable. Please share it with somebody else. If you found value in this, let somebody else know you found some value as well. With that being said, Tommy, where else can you find the podcast?
You can find us on Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. Make sure to subscribe and leave a rating. It helps us out a ton. And please share with a friend. We do this for free. We love having you guys around. Do you have a question, idea, or a topic that you want us to talk about in a future episode, like today? Head over to powerbi.tips/podcast, leave your name and a great question. And finally, join us live every Tuesday and Thursday, 7:30 a.m. and join the conversation on all powerbi.tips social media channels.
Awesome. Thank you all so much, and we'll see you next time.